started to scream just at the top of my lungs, and he came up to me, shut up, and he just, shut up, don't scream. If you don't scream, I won't hurt you.
Ashley Smith, a single mother with no knowledge of what was going on in the area, arrived at home and came face to face with the armed killer, holding her hostage at gunpoint for 7 hours. A single mom held captive by the accused Atlanta spree killer.
I thought I was gonna die, really.
We'd all like to think we understand what happens to a criminal when they are sent to prison. The idea that when someone commits a crime, the police would arrest them and send them to prison until they can be rehabilitated. This makes the procedure simpler, but even so, we take comfort in the notion that the worst members of society are imprisoned far away, where they are unable to harm people. But what happens if the legal system doesn't function as expected? What happens when the evildoer flees with just that one thought? Retaliation. As Ashley Smith made her way to her apartment door, the streets were peaceful. Depending on how you look at it, it was either early or late at 2 a.m., like she had done many evenings before. She had popped out to get some cigarettes from a local store, but this night would not go out the same way as the others. Ashley felt a gun at her side as she inserted her key into the lock. The voice then came to her. "If you do as I say, I won't kill you." She was afraid, but having no other option, she allowed the shooter to lead her into her apartment. This was it, Ashley knew. She was quite certain that the man would kill her. She reflected on the fact that she would never see her 5-year-old daughter's happy face again. Her daughter was living with Ashley's aunt. Since high school, Ashley had battled a drug addiction, and she was currently attempting to rebuild her life. After being stabbed after a fight, Ashley held her husband as he passed away in her arms. Since then, her drug use has spiraled out of control to the point where she smashed her car while driving while experiencing a meth-induced psychosis. She had previously narrowly avoided death, but she was confident that this time she would not survive. She waited for the gun to discharge as it made its sound. She heard the most odd sound. The shower began to run. The man who was there to kill her was, of all things, taking a shower. She remained motionless until she heard the shower stop. Ashley was then face to face with her captor after the man removed the dish towel from her head. The man was 33-year-old Brian Nichols, though she was unaware of this at the time. Additionally, she had escaped from custody just hours prior. On December 10th, 1971, Brian Nichols was born into a household of the middle class. Prior to enrolling in Kutztown, University of Pennsylvania, he attended Cardinal Gibbons High School in Baltimore, Maryland. Given his intimidating 6'1" height and 210-pound weight, it is not surprising that Brian decided to play linebacker for the football team in college. People who knew Brian at the time recall him as someone who ought to be taken seriously. His penchant for running afoul of the law only served to enhance his reputation as an agitator. Brian was accused of disorderly behavior, harassing and making terroristic threats in 1990. He was once more accused of disorderly conduct, misdemeanor criminal mischief, and criminal trespassing the following year. He left Kutztown University and enrolled at Newberry College because the allegations he was facing could have ended his future as a college football player. As soon as possible, he joined the football squad and informed his coaches that he was looking forward to a new beginning and will put his old problems behind him. Brian tried to turn over a new leaf, but it didn't stick, and he had problems staying out of trouble. His goal of playing football was permanently crushed when he was expelled from the team after being caught stealing. After that, Brian declared he had enough of college and quit. He moved to Georgia and accepted a position as a Unix system engineer. Brian merely appeared to calm down at that point. He had a decent job and frequently went to the neighborhood church. Brian's life was pleasant, and despite his troubled past and numerous run-ins with the law, he appeared to have settled in. However, all changed in 2004. Brian allegedly found out that his ex-girlfriend had started dating the church minister. Although Brian's relationship with his ex-girlfriend had ended years before, he was unable to let go. In a moment of jealous rage, Brian broke into the apartment of his ex-girlfriend, bound her with duct tape, and forced her into a sexual assault while holding a gun. She managed to escape the assault and identify Brian as her attacker. A date for his trial was set after he was charged and arrested. But locking Brian up wasn't going to be easy. Up until the point when the jury was asked to consider whether Brian was guilty or innocent, Brian's first trial went off without a hitch. An official mistrial was declared because the jury was unable to agree. Despite the defeat, the prosecution declared that they will pursue a retrial because they were committed to bringing Brian to justice. Brian was overheard saying, "I'm not going to go lying down." After hearing the news, it was obvious that Brian believed he could persuade the jury once more when the second trial started. He started making fun of the prosecutor, saying that the second trial was going to be a little better than the first. However, Brian only used the bravado as a cover for his fear. He knew in his heart that he would not get away with his actions this time, and that he would almost certainly have to serve time in jail. But despite the harsh reality of the circumstances, Brian didn't change how he was acting. Instead, he made a promise. He told everyone that he would not go down without a fight. Those in attendance at the time might have believed that his statements were simply the ramblings of a guy who was about to face justice. However, they quickly realized that they weren't just hollow threats. They were a serious oath. People expressed fear that Brian had come up with a scheme in the days preceding the conclusion of the second trial. According to several witnesses, first, one of Brian's buddies informed the DA's office that he believed Brian was plotting an escape. The Fulton County Sheriff's Office was notified of Brian's intention to steal an officer's weapon by his own mother. 2 days before Brian's escape, the last sign that something was wrong with him appeared. By then, he was a desperate man, and desperate men often make violent decisions. Officers discovered what seemed to be 2 door hinges hidden in his shoes as they were escorting him back to his cell from the courts. They worried he'd turned them into shanks, a frequent and lethal weapon used in prison. Following this incident, Judge Barnes, who presided over the second trial, decided to install more security to the building during Brian's testimony. Perhaps they feared that if he was going to try and pull something, he would do it then. Now, on the morning of March 11th, 2005, like it did every morning, the bus that took Brian from the jail to the courthouse, the guard who would take Brian to the imprisonment cell on the 8th level of the courtroom was waiting for him when Brian got off the bus. The guard had already transported Brian on countless times. Cynthia Hall was her name. Cynthia was only 51 years old. Despite what you may believe, she was not intimidated by the big man because she knew Brian wouldn't try anything. When a co-worker suggested Cynthia call for assistance when transferring Brian, she responded, "No, I got him." In her opinion, she had handled situations alone many times before, so why would that day be different from others? Cynthia took him from the bus to the 8th level. She made the decision not to place leg shackles on him. Cynthia will quickly discover that putting her trust in this prisoner would have fatal repercussions. Brian was uncuffed when Cynthia and he arrived at the holding cell so he could change into his trial outfit. She attempted to release his second hand, but she was unexpectedly punched in the face. When she sought medical assistance for her injuries, the doctors announced that she was in a coma because she had been struck so forcefully. She still has problems now, and as a result of the strike to the face, the amount of force Brian applied with his hand was evident in the result of just one punch. Brian then took Cynthia's Beretta 40mm semi-automatic pistol when she was unconscious and imprisoned her in his cell. He then moved to another cell, changed into the trial outfit, and left the holding area. You could be thinking right now that someone must be looking at the CCTV footage. Am I right? But you'd be disappointed. Nobody was around watching, and nobody was aware that a dangerous individual was still at large. Brian didn't immediately head for freedom after leaving the holding area, as you might have expected. Retaliation was what motivated Brian. He chose not to descend the steps, which would have brought him outside. Instead, he took off straight for Judge Barnes. Brian encountered 2 case managers as well as an attorney as he made his way to the judge's chambers. He wanted to know where Judge Barnes was at while pointing the gun at them. However, a bailiff entered the chambers as he waited to learn more. He attempted to wrestle the gun from Brian, but Brian rapidly outweighed him. The other captives were handcuffed by the bailiff when Brian stole his weapon. He followed instructions, but he was aware that only he was in a position to try to stop Brian, despite the fact that he lacked a firearm. The bailiff thus activated the emergency button while Brian wasn't looking, alerting the other officers that they were required. However, the officers verbally reacted to the alarm over the radio to determine what assistance was required. Now that backup was on the way, Brian knew about it. In an effort to persuade the other officers that it was a false alarm, he took the bailiff's radio. Fortunately, the deputies recognized the bailiff's voice and realized the caller was not a co-worker. Brian realized now he needed to move immediately. The courtroom where his trial was scheduled to begin that day was where he locked the bailiff in before entering. He finally located Judge Barnes in the courtroom, who he had been looking for all along. He pulled the trigger while aiming the gun towards the judge's head, instantly killing him. The court reporter, Julia Brando, was suddenly the target of his gunshot. She died instantly from his gunfire. He then turned to scan the courtroom for any of his other targets, the prosecution's team and his ex-girlfriend. Brian quickly made his way to the emergency stairs because, fortunately, no one else had entered the courtroom yet.
Shooting and killing the very judge who requested he be given extra security.
The courthouse alarm rang as Sergeant Hoyt Teasley started his shift that morning. To carry out his obligation to defend and assist, he ran. Brian then suddenly descended the stairway quickly. The police had no way of knowing that Brian had only seconds before murdered 2 individuals. He was now a suspected killer in addition to a rapist. When Brian reached the exterior entrance, Sergeant Teasley was hard on his trail and pursued him down 7 flights of stairs. As Brian burst through the door, he continued shooting rounds in the air. He failed to stop the cop, though. So then Brian turned back and started shooting since he realized he couldn't escape without a battle. At the officer, he fired twice. On the fire escape steps, Sergeant Teasley became another one of Brian's murder victims. After leaving the courthouse, Brian stole a car and fled the area quickly. He entered a parking lot and blocked the entrance with the car while he was just a few blocks away. He then entered another parking garage and attempted to steal another vehicle while holding up another driver with a gun. He then attempted to kidnap the car's driver, but she was able to escape. Then he went up to another driver and instructed him to enter his own trunk. The driver resisted him once again, so Brian used a revolver to hit him in the head. He then drove off in the man's stolen vehicle. It could be challenging to comprehend the unpredictable character of Brian's getaway at this point in the story. He may have stolen so many automobiles and hurt so many people because he intended to cause as much disaster as he could. After failing to capture someone, Brian went to the train station and boarded a train bound for the north. He eventually reached Buckhead, Atlanta. He made an attempt to enter a woman's residence and take her hostage. But the woman's boyfriend confronted him as soon as he walked into her apartment. While the wife dialed 911, the boyfriend and Brian engaged in some brief fighting. When Brian saw that the police were coming, he shot the boyfriend in the head and ran away. It is obvious that Brian was a directionless madman with nothing to lose but his newly acquired freedom. His first motivation seemed to be retaliation against the judge and his ex-girlfriend, but it appeared that he hadn't given it any more thought. He became far more dangerous as a result of this. Brian was a madman, a dangerous man, and authorities would do anything to take him into custody.
His victims in March 2005, Judge Roland Barnes, court reporter Julie Brandau, Deputy Hoyt Teasley, federal agent David Wilhelm.
Therefore, they provided a $65,000 reward for information that resulted in his capture. Brian came into contact with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent David Wilhelm at some point during his escape. What transpired between the two men is not explicitly described in the report. Agent William, however, was discovered shot to death in his own house the following day. The person who shot him made off with his pickup truck, rifle, and money. That leads us to the early morning time of 2 a.m. when Ashley entered her apartment building on March 12th. Brian saw her. She didn't know who Brian was or what he had done, but she was smart enough to know that he was dangerous. When he started taking a shower, Ashley realized she had to make him see her as a human being, rather than just another obstacle in his path if she wanted to have any chance of surviving. She then began to talk. She told him about her daughter and the reason she no longer lived with her. They both talked about their troubles with life for hours. Ashley spoke to Brian about her struggle with drug abuse and her efforts to rediscover her relationship with God. Ashley gave Brian some meth when he inquired about whether or not she had any drugs in the house, but she refused to use any herself. Ashley eventually requested permission to read Brian a book. The title of the book was The Purpose-Driven Life. They began to discuss their intentions. Ashley then inquired as to Brian's perception of her life's significance. Brian responded, "I think you need to share your story with people to help other people." Then he asked her what she thought he ought to do regarding the predicament he was in. Ashley advised him to turn himself in. Everyone makes mistakes in life, she reassured him, and he must live with the results of his decisions. On March 3rd, early in the morning, Brian asked Ashley if she would follow him while he moved the pickup truck that he had taken earlier. Since Brian broke into Ashley's apartment, it had been more than 7 hours. When dropping off the car, Brian promised to take Ashley back to her house with him. Ashley served them both pancakes for breakfast after they got back to her home. She questioned him after the energy faded away. Would he agree to let her leave so she could see her daughter? Brian surprised her by agreeing and even giving her some cash to use if necessary. Ashley wasn't going to blow her one chance to be free. She left the apartment as soon as possible, got in her car, and went. She informed 911 where they could find Brian while she was still on the road by making the call. Armed police showed up at Ashley's home a short while afterwards. Brian waved a white towel as a sign of his submission rather than engaging in the altercation they were anticipating, and he was taken into custody without a hitch. It had been more than 26 hours since his release from detention. At that point, 54 offenses, including 4 counts of murder, were brought against Brian. On November 7, 2008, Brian was found guilty of all charges and given a life sentence following the murders. After suing the county, Judge Barnes' wife received a $5.2 million settlement. A $5 million settlement was also paid to Julie Brando's daughter as a reward for her assistance in Brian's capture. Ashley received $70,000. There is just one way to adequately explain this crime. It was foolishness. Brian didn't have any justification for attacking a woman he hadn't been seeing in 8 years. He had no business attacking people who were merely carrying out their jobs. And he had no business drawing so many people into the path of his insane flight. Though the story is ultimately filled with tragedy and loss, there is one piece of positive news that might inspire some optimism. Since the day she was taken hostage, Ashley has not touched alcohol or drugs at all.
I realized actually the next morning when Brian Nichols let me go free that God really did have a bigger plan for my life, and it was something that I couldn't imagine, but He has played it out through the last 7 years of my life, and in a life, like I said, that has been unimaginable.
She succeeded in turning her life around, and she even published a book on the event and how it altered her perspective. She remarried in the years following her captivity, regained custody of her daughter, and had a son with her new husband. Ashley was fortunate enough to recover from this catastrophe of almost death. While those who lost loved ones during Brian's reign of terror will find little solace in this, those who might be dealing with substance abuse might find fresh hope in Ashley's tale. That life exists beyond darkness. I appreciate you watching, folks. What are your opinions on this case? Did Brian get a fair punishment for what he did? Please let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.